Tony DeAngelo back on Connecticut Morning. George Harrison, the Beatles. I want to tell you that this is going to be a really fun interview. It's also, you got to get through dinner to get through dessert. Now we're getting to dessert. We're getting to the candy shop of life, as Ogden Nash used to say, baseball. And with that, I would like to introduce my good friend Ron Anderson, the author of Long Taters, a biography of George the Boomer Scott. For those of you who were old enough to see George play, he played between 1966 and 1979 with the Boston Red Sox, the Milwaukee Brewers, and Kansas City Royals. Ended up with the New York Yankees. And Ron, it's a pleasure to have you once again. Thanks for appearing with us. And
thanks for having me, Tony.
And I love telling this story, and I told it the last time you were on. My very first recollection of George Scott, I think I was either 10 or 11 years old, and I had come home from grade school, and back in those days the Yankees would play a lot of, I was in Stamford, Connecticut, they would play a lot of afternoon games. So I turned on the Yankee broadcast, and I saw this very large black man facing Whitey Ford for the Red Sox, and I saw Whitey Ford throw the ball. I saw this very large black man who happened to be George Scott swing the bat, and I saw a ball go into orbit, and I thought, who is this man? And I'll tell you, that and a couple of the homers that Dick Allen hit when he was with the Phillies give me chills to this day. But tell us about George and what fascinated you in wanting to write a book on his life.
Well, first of all, Tony, I think the fact that you saw that particular home run was probably one of the great moments in sport, really.
Yeah.
And the research that I did, which extended about 5 years, amongst former ball players that he played with and against, it stated that they never saw a home run hit quite that far. Maybe Mickey Mantle might have matched it. He had a few of his own, but George hit a tremendous wallop that day. You saw it. I interviewed Rico Petrocelli, and Rico said that it was just, he laughed initially because he was just so astounded. He says the sound of the bat was just so loud, it never heard it. He said never saw a ball hit so far. So it was 505 feet. It was ultimately measured to be. So that was quite a clout. Josh Gibson type home run. But anyway, as far as the, I'm sorry, Tony.
No, please continue.
Okay. I was totally fascinated with George's story, to be honest with you. I had written an article, a 5,000-word article, for a book that we did with the Sabre Group on the Impossible Dream Red Sox of 1967, and I got George as my subject. And as I began to delve into the history of this man, I realized that this was truly a story in survival. And because he was born in Mississippi back in 1944, he was actually literally born on a plantation, cotton plantation, which historically went back to the days of slavery. And his mother, actually his father died when George was a year old, so we never knew his father. And his mother, you can just imagine that. Here's a lady, a black woman living in Mississippi on a plantation, all of a sudden has to fend for herself. And George was the youngest of 3 children, and they were all young at the time. And then she moved up to Greenville, Mississippi, which is really the heart of the Delta. And of course, extreme segregation. It is simply a story in survival. George survived because he was a phenomenal athlete. And he was a free sports star at an all-black school, Coleman High School. He was a quarterback on the football team. It seemed kind of odd in a way. He was a big man, so it seemed odd that he was a quarterback. He was 6'2", weighed about 200 pounds in high school, but just a ferocious player. And captain of the basketball team, who won the state championship in 1962, his senior year. And of course, the same is true, captain of the baseball team as well. And he went on, the Red Sox actually signed him in 1962. There was a lot of story as to just exactly what that amount was. It's commonly referred to as a $10,000 contract, but I verified through Milt Bowling and Ed Scott. Ed Scott, a namesake of George, was the fellow who actually signed him, and he signed him for $8,000. Which was probably big money at that time, certainly for a black.
Well, it was a year's salary, yeah.
You know, but George had a content little lot, and one of the reasons he went to baseball, he actually his best sport was the way he put it. His best sport was basketball. He averaged 33 points a game for the Coleman High School team. They won the state championship. He carried the team on his back, according to his coach, whom I interviewed, and. You know, he was just a phenomenal basketball player. But he said that he went to baseball because he wanted to start earning money just as quickly as he could, so he could take his mother out of poverty, which is exactly what he did. So he had this drive to just make the major league team, and for some of you who remember George Scott, he had a phenomenal spring training with the Red Sox in 1966. Mm-hmm. And he had about 5 home runs and 3 triples. I mean, just playing, it almost seemed above his head. And he caught the attention of the Red Sox brass. And Billy Herman, who was the manager then, simply said, "You know what? You're coming on the major league squad. And you're going to start in Boston." He actually beat out a fellow by the name of Joe Foy. Joe Foy was
remember him well.
Player in AAA, and Foy, well, he simply beat him out. He took his job, and was starting third baseman, not first baseman, third baseman. That's basically the position he played. So that's really kind of a thumbnail, quick sketch of George.
Of George. Now you know, it's interesting because we come into the 1960s, and I'm just kind of drawing a line here. And, you know, we have that 66 team, which turns with some modifications into that 67 team. And I'm seeing Joe Foy, I'm seeing Reggie Smith, I'm seeing George Scott, I'm seeing Elston Howard come later in the year, and I'm thinking, hey, wait a minute, this is Boston. Was there some kind of, and I think I know the answer to this, but was there some kind of newfound openness to black players, or was it the kind of thing where, you know, it was, you know, sort of business as usual, Boston being, you know, historically the last team to admit a black player, and I guess if I'm not mistaken, and you can tell me if this is urban legend or not, there was a tryout in the 50s where they had a look-see at Jackie Robinson and a couple of players and passed on them. I mean, how does all this evolve to where you've got like 3 or 4 really prominent, productive black players, and still I don't think their lives were any easier when they were playing well for this club?
Very true, and I think it's a good summation of what had occurred. It was actually in 1945 that this infamous tryout took place with Jackie Robinson, Sam Jethro, and I think there was a fellow named Williams, lesser known, and it was really kind of a mock tryout. So in any event, the Red Sox simply were just going through the motions because they were receiving a lot of pressure from one particular media person in Boston. So they gave it a shot, but it was nothing more than a failed attempt. And after that, probably even more, or as importantly, they also took a hard look at Willie Mays.
That I did not know.
He was playing down in Alabama at the time, Birmingham Black Barons, and I did interview one of the fellows there who was actually the secretary of the club, who has since passed away, and he gave me some insight into what had occurred at that time. And there, too, was simply a mock effort on the part of the Red Sox. They simply were going through the motions of looking at this kid called Willie Mays, and they rejected him. And in fact, I talked to George Digby, who was the head scout. He still survives today, and interviewed him about that incident. And Digby said that he was going to buy Mays for, I think it was like $6,000 or something like that. So anyway, Ultimately, yeah, there were still issues in the 60s, but I think one of the reasons why the Red Sox began to acquire black players was because of the new general manager by the name of Dick O'Connell. And Dick O'Connell was pretty much given the freedom to do what he wanted, which is kind of unusual when you think about a fellow by the name of Tom Yawkey, who certainly had his legacy of issues concerning race. But I think there was also some pressure at the same time that was being brought by some of the media in the city. To me, it was probably more of a newsworthy type of thing, and they simply mentioned the fact that, what's the matter with the Red Sox? Why don't they have a black player? Because, of course, they had pretty much rejected Pumpsie Green, who came up in 1959. So with some of that inner pressure and the fact that you also had a fellow named Dick O'Connell who was interested in winning ball games and therefore interested in hiring black players and trading for black players, this is, of course, when you begin to see the transformation. But it was still a situation that was, when you went to Fenway Park, you still saw more black players on the field than you did in the stands. And I think to some extent that may be true today.
Well, I'll tell you, and a fascination for me, and I know we've discussed this, because I saw him play, and I thought he was, to me, he's one of the few major league black 20 game winners was Earl Wilson, who I thought was an incredibly fine pitcher. And Earl, from what I recall, was maybe sometimes acute, sometimes blunt, sometimes outspoken, and he didn't have an easy time in Boston from, I think, what you and I had discussed.
Well, that's true, and that was really kind of on the cutting edge, because Earl Wilson was in their system at the same time that Pumpsie Green was in the system. So in some respects, you'd have to wonder why Earl wasn't brought up even before Pumpsie Green. But they happened to have at the time a manager by the name of Mike Pinky Higgins. And he was probably about as racist a man as there could be. And he had vowed that he would not, field any black players. But as a result of pressure, of course, they brought up Pumpsie Green, who was not a particularly great ball player, but it was just kind of symbolic that they knew that they had to get somebody on the field. So they brought Green up at 59. And then after that, Earl Wilson came up. Earl Wilson actually pitched a no-hitter in 1962 for the Red Sox.
Yes.
But he had trouble staying on the Major League club because Higgins was still there. So every time, Wilson would appear, Higgins found a way to push it back down to the minors. And once Higgins was fired, I think it was 1965, and O'Connell took over, then you saw the influx of black players on the Red Sox team.
Now, I've often envisioned the fact that being a black player in Boston, I think Bill Russell in basketball, who of course was very outspoken, Bill at times might have given you too much information, but this was not an easy road to hoe, honestly, truthfully.
No. Bill Russell, of course, famously remarked that Boston was the flea market of racism. He had some trouble in the suburbia, even trying to establish himself, his residence there. Well accepted, as was true with the black players of that era in Boston when they were on the team. But they certainly didn't have the freedom beyond that to enjoy life the way the white folks of Boston did. They couldn't go to certain places. There was a social stratification issue. Reggie Smith, who came on the team in '67, he was very upset. He was kind of a very strong-willed kind of guy, and he just couldn't handle the Boston scene. And ultimately, that was probably one of the reasons why he was traded away to St. Louis.
He had a long, productive career. And so we have George. Getting back to George, who's really the protagonist of the interview, if you will, and he's playing under a fella who, far as the records say, was a legendary baseball figure by the name of Dick Williams, and I guess Dick and George really didn't see a lot of common ground, if I understand correctly.
No, it was a very strange relationship. There was something very pathological that seemed to be existing between Dick Williams and George. Other teammates, including, I remember quite well, Rico Petroselli, saying that he never quite understand why they would make things so public. Williams was the type of guy that if he was upset about something, he would simply let the press know about it, and anybody who was willing to listen. And
yeah, which was perfect for those Oakland A's teams, but it didn't play so well in Boston.
No, no. Williams later said that if he was ever managing today, you know, well, first of all, he probably wouldn't be managing, he said, because he would never survive. But in that era, he still was very dictatorial, but he just, there was a point where I think it almost was a feeling of a racial element to it. And I explored it with a fellow by the name of Jim Grant, who was a very fine pitcher.
Yes, watched him.
And Grant said that, you know, Williams might not have even really known that he was racist, but he said it was just the way that it was. They treated blacks differently in those days. And they would vehemently deny that they had any element of racism in them. But he said it was in them. And of course, he played for Dick Williams. So I found that to be a very fascinating interview. But Williams was tough on George, and George said that this was the first time in his life, in playing sports, that somebody had got into his mind, and Dick Williams did.
And this is I want to clarify this with you, because this to me seems incredible. Is it true that the black Boston Red Sox players of that era were not invited to the family events?
In '66, I'm aware of that being an issue. We also know that that occurred in somewhere around 1985. I'm not sure I've got the exact date correct here, with Tommy Harper. I don't know if you remember the incident with him, when he complained that the Elks Club apparently had extended certain invitations to the ball players, but that was excluding the black players, and he became very upset about that. But back in 1966, George does remember that black players were not invited to the social events held by the Red Sox. Yes.
It's an amazing thing. And at one point you had mentioned that Dick Williams, talk about getting into the poor guy's head. Here's Dick Williams, who's like a career, banjo hitter, wants to change George's swing.
Right, right. And George said that that's when they really parted ways, when he was attempting to change the swing. Ted Williams said, told George, he said, don't let anybody ever change his swing.
Yeah, what did he know?
And, all right.
I said, what did he know? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really kind of turned the tide for George, because he was trying very hard. He even used Bobby Doerr to attempt to get George to basically hit the right in center field, which was his inclination. That's the way he usually hit.
Mm-hmm.
But they were talking about getting singles and doubles out of George, when George, of course, was capable of hitting home runs.
It's an amazing thing. He ends up in 1972 in Milwaukee, and he has his managers there. You talk about kind of dyed-in-the-wool guys that sort of had these perceptions about black people, probably by imprinting. Dave Bristol, Del Crandall, and I know that necessarily was, or not necessarily, was a fun time. How did all that come about, and how did George find Milwaukee?
Well, I think George was largely okay. The city was not really an issue as far as the black community is concerned, at least that I remember from George. He did have some issues, of course, with Del Crandall. Del Crandall actually had fined him a couple of times, basically for, we believe, to be loafing. And that, of course, is about the last thing you can attribute to George Scott is being a loafer. He was one of the hardest workers on the team. So we think that there might have been some racial issues there with Del Crandall. But as far as the community as a whole, they seem to be a little bit more accepting of the black ball player than Boston ever was at that time.
And he did get to play as time went on with Henry Aaron, who I guess was sort of a father figure and a mentor and a guide for him.
Right, exactly. George said that was one of his greatest moments in Major League Baseball, aside from the time when he was actually playing for a fellow named Frank Robinson in Santurce, Puerto Rico. But he said that when he was with Aaron, it was just a great time for him. And it turned out that George had the greatest year that he ever had in 1975 when Aaron was on the team. Nearly won the most valuable player, hit the most home runs, most RBIs in a career year. And he attributed a great deal of that to Henry Aaron.
It's really something. And then just studying his career, he leaves Milwaukee. He finds his way back in Boston, of all places, in 1977, where judging, or actually reading the list that you've so kindly provided, there was a little event that happened on something called the Cliff and Claff Show. And, you know, I'm just trying to set the stage here. Here's George back in town. Seems like not much is really changing in Boston regarding racial perceptions. And comment on that if you would.
Well, Cliff Keene and Larry Claflin, Keene was with the Globe, and Larry Claflin, I think, was with the Herald. They had this talk show, a sports talk show. And George happened to be on. They brought him into the studio. And, of course, George here is just recently back with the Red Sox.
Right.
After he get his footing. And so they apparently got into this little display of chicken and watermelon scenario. And they got into this laughter and basically making fun of, ultimately it seemed they were really kind of making fun of George. And George simply accepted what they were doing. He didn't seem to argue the point. His concern was just simply staying in touch with the city and with the Red Sox, and so he let it go. But it became a big issue, and you saw it in the newspapers for several days after that. And neither Keene or Claflin really felt that they were embarking on racial issues at that time, although it seemed quite clear that they were.
It's yeah, and from there, I'm just studying the reference chart. He has a decent year in '77, maybe not a great year in '78. '79, he finds himself in Kansas City, and later with the New York Yankees, and I guess a very I guess if you want to call it sort of an odd couple pairing with, of all people, Billy Martin.
Right. Yeah, George classified Billy Martin as probably the best manager that he ever played for.
Isn't that something?
And he qualified that by saying that he was just simply technically sound. I mean, if you think about all of the things that were baggage that was attached to Billy Martin, one might question that. But George says from a baseball person solely, he said he was very technically solid. And he did well with the Yankees. He actually, I think he batted around 318 or something like that for the short stint that he played for them. And he thought, sure, because Martin was there, that he would be brought back. But I think it was right around that time that Thurman Munson was killed in an air crash, and it was just a pall over the team. And I think it was right around that time that Steinbrenner decided he was going to rebuild that team. And so George, of course, was not factored into that. So.
And did George want to remain in baseball after 1979, or did he volunteer?
He did. He was pretty much involved in baseball in different forms. He went to the Mexican League, for about 5 years. He was really trying to get back into Major League Baseball. Of course, when that didn't work out, then he was interested in doing coaching and managing, and he started a little of that in the Mexican League. And then
I see that.
He kicked around with the independent leagues for a few years, and he finally wound up. He actually went down to Texas. I think he was in the independent league down there for a year. And then he finished his baseball career with the Berkshire Black Bears, ironically back in Pittsfield, Mass, where he played.
Yeah, yeah, that old classic stadium there. Yeah.
Yeah, Wacona Stadium.
Wacona, right?
And he finally finished his career at that point. So George is now back in Greenville, Mississippi, in the home that he built for his mother.
Isn't that something? And how often do you speak with George, and how's he doing?
He's doing pretty well. George just turned 69 this past Saturday. He's had a little trouble getting around. He's got a couple of bad knees, so he's pretty much on a cane or a walker at this point in time. It's hard to believe from him. It was so adept around the first base bag. But anyway, but he's doing pretty well. I'd probably talk to him maybe once every couple, 3 weeks.
Well, you know, and he's a guy that gave us a lot of pleasure through the years, and he was a guy that when he came out to the field, he gave you everything he had, and he swung hard and he hustled, and as you say, just a really good first baseman, and yeah, somebody who you really wish that circumstances in baseball history could have been a heck of a whole lot more kinder to. I mean, honestly.
Well, absolutely, and that's that's part of the story, of course, that is somewhat puzzling. Is that the Red Sox seem to continue to turn their back on him when he obviously exhibited signs of potential of being a very good coach and/or manager. And Major League Baseball did the same, and it's sort of enigmatic as to why that even occurred. But in any event, that is unfortunately some of the resentment that George still holds. I think he could have been a very good coach. He loved kids. He loved working with kids, and I think he would have been a great instructor.
Well, and he's a part of, I mean, me, growing up closer to the New York border, I was well aware of his presence and saw him come into Yankee Stadium many times and always feared his stick and respected his glove, and so grateful and thankful that you've documented his life and whatever we can do to give George the attention he deserves. In our closing minute, literally, Ron, where can our friends and fans reach you to get your book and have you come and talk about George and share your wonderful baseball knowledge and knowledge of baseball history?
Well, I have a Facebook page. It's the title of the book, Long Taters, Baseball Biography of George Boomer Scott. You can get the book, of course, at Amazon. You can also get it through the bookstores by ordering it. George also has a website of his own. He has a blog, actually, GeorgeBoomerScott.com. George is willing to sign books. He's actually selling some himself, and he's signing books. So you can communicate with him that way. I also have an email. It's Andy42man@yahoo.com. And
it's an honor and a pleasure to have you. Thanks so much for being with us, and I'm sure we'll be chatting during the baseball season and on Facebook. And while we shake our head on what's happening with baseball today, we can remember George and the quality of the game during this this golden era that we were pleasured to see. Ron, thanks so much.
Thank you, Tony.
And that was Ron Anderson, author of Long Taters, the biographer of George the Boomer Scott. And